excited to do this presentation, this is not the first time it's happened to me like this, where people have asked me to do a presentation on something that I think I know something about, and I go, oh sure, I can do that, and it's a lot of work, and because this is a talk that I'm calling On the Dark Side of the Moon, Creative and Artistic Responses to War and Trauma, my process of actually putting this talk together will reflect some of the things that I will be explaining to you about what trauma is as we're going through this. I did one part, and that part was maybe at the end, and then I did another part somewhere else, and so the whole thing kind of came together piece by piece, and it very much fits the topic, and each of the sections that I have comments in could be an entire talk unto itself. There's just so much material. I'm going to do an introduction, and you're invited to sit for the introduction, and then as I start into the sections that are on the handout, war trauma, and on from there, I'm going to ask you to go and really look at the artwork in that section. An apt quote by James Finley, a former Trappist monk who is now a renowned spiritual counselor, who had studied with theologian, mystic, and social activist Thomas Merton, offers a way to think about some of the artwork by the 20th century modernists in this exhibition. His quote suggests that those who have experienced war and trauma also have the capacity to respond creatively to such catastrophic events. Finley notes, no matter what has been done to us in the past, and no matter how broken and confused it might have left us, the pearls of great price continue to shine within us, which no one can diminish or destroy. These artists, whose artwork was created over a 60-year span, 1910 to 1970, give visual witness to the words of James Finley. The pearl of great price continues to shine within us. The paintings, drawings, prints, and sculpture on view in this exhibition came about during years of cataclysmic social, cultural, and political change, periods of disintegrating old orders, chaotic and destructive disorders, and tender and blossoming new orders. The first 30 years saw the end of the genteel Victorian and Edwardian eras, the beginning of progressivism, a great war that changed the world's geopolitical landscape, a global flu pandemic, the Russian Revolution, a Great Depression that upended economic security, the rise of the far-right Nazi and fascist regimes, and the Spanish Civil War. The next 30 years witnessed a devastating Second World War, the Jewish Holocaust, a war in Korea, the rise of the women's movement, race riots and Black Power struggles, and the Vietnam War. These worldwide events are the backdrop for the lives of the 37 artists whose artwork is on display in this show, and their artistic expressions represent at least 23 distinctive modernist styles, most prominently abstractionism, fauvism, expressionism, cubism, Dadaism, and surrealism. Modernism was a worldwide phenomenon that was not only a response to disturbing current events, but also a distinct revolt against traditional artistic orders. On view here are the unique interpretations of artists from 13 different countries, from the US to Germany, Austria, England, Russia, France, the Ukraine, Spain, the Netherlands, Lithuania, Croatia, Mexico, and Greece. Finally, of the 37 artists whose work is on view, some 25 were either conscripted for military service, tried to join a war, were persecuted in their own country, or were forced to emigrate because of war. Each one of these artists made artwork in response to their own particular artistic influences and specific war experiences. It's the art of 20 of these 25 artists, actually 17, I've had to cut out a few, that will offer insight into the philosophical underpinnings of the modernist style they embraced and the way which these approaches were influenced by the chaos and destruction of the First and Second World Wars. As artists who endured war service, persecution, and forced immigration, such personal trauma stories provide a way to understand how such events fully impacted their bodies, minds, and souls. The resiliency of these artists, James Finley's "The Pearl of Great Price" continues to shine within us, is demonstrated by their creative pursuit of various types of artistic expression. Art making in the modernist styles, art making as an act of witness, art making for rehabilitation and well-being, and art making as social activism. The experiences of African Americans during and after the First and Second World War offer a study of systemic-based racial trauma and an example of encouraging change. Finally, in closing, heartfelt images made by artists decades after their war experience can be read as metaphorical tributes of loss and commemoration. All right. So the first section is war trauma, and it's related to the painting by Gustav Klimt. This is a collotype that was produced based on Klimt's 1915 painting called Death and Life. The subject matter represents one of Klimt's ongoing artistic themes, the modern dance of death, a powerful allegory for everyday life occurrences throughout European culture of the early 20th century. Stylistically, though, this image, with its glittering pieces of mosaic shards assembled into portrayals of life and death, can be read as a metaphor of trauma, a representation of shattering events reassembled and transformed. Klimt's painting is a visual that offers an understanding of the shattering impact of trauma. There are basically three types: acute trauma resulting from a single stressful or dangerous event, chronic trauma from repeated and prolonged exposure to highly stressful experiences, and complex trauma from exposure to multiple traumatic situations. War trauma combines all three of these types and includes, but is not limited to, war violence, forced isolation, torture, rape, and threats to individuals and their families. During the First and Second World War, the Spanish War, and the years in between these wars, the lives of at least 25 of the artists included in this exhibition faced nearly every type of trauma described here. Through conscription or enlistment, some 9 artists from 6 countries gave service during World War I with either the Allied forces or the opposing Central Powers. Of these 9, 4 were injured or exposed to mustard gas, and 1 saw duty as a clerk at a prisoner of war camp. 2 lives were affected by the Spanish Civil War, one from conscription and detention in an internment camp, and the other from restricted travel. Another 3 artists, all Americans, served in the Second World War, but only one briefly as he was discharged after contracting tuberculosis. One other American artist tried to enlist but was turned down because of underlying health issues. During the 2 world wars, 3 artists lost their family members and friends to either casualties on the battlefield or from other unintended consequences. Another 7 were forced to flee from one country to another, and 3 others were not allowed to leave the countries where they were then living. Between the wars, during the rise of the Nazi regime, when the contributions of artists and intellectuals were under attack, 6 artists were forced to resign faculty positions, were banned from exhibitions, found their artwork removed from museum collections, and mocked by the Nazis, who displayed 650 pieces of modern art in their degenerate art exhibition in 1937. Ridiculing the work of modernists, the Nazis described the art as insulting German feelings, destroying or confusing natural forms, or simply revealing an absence of adequate manual and artistic skills. As conditions even worsened, these artists were forced to hide their artwork or watch it destroyed. They hid to stay safe, were terrified of being arrested and deported to Nazi concentration camps. They witnessed the bombing of their home and studio and found their citizenship had been revoked shortly before they were arrested. None of these artists came through these wrenching, stressful, uncertain, and loss-filled experience without an impact on their personal lives and artistic production. Post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and depression often follow traumatic events, so it's not surprising to note that some artists dramatically changed their styles in response to what they had witnessed during the wars, while others stopped making art altogether for a while. Most notably, Katie Caldex saw purpose to her art making. It kept her resilient and able to carry on. She claimed art making as her duty to voice the sufferings of humankind, the never-ending sufferings heaped mountain high. This is my task, but is not an easy one to fulfill. The modernist styles that so offended the sensibilities of the Nazi regime trace back to the late 19th century, extending from the 1860s to the 1970s, with the first decades of the 20th century as the golden age of the isms: abstractionism, fauvism, cubism, and expressionism, and during and after the First World War, Dadaism and Surrealism. These modernist styles, and many, many others, are associated with approaches that embrace experimentation and threw aside traditions of the past. They played with shape, colors, and line in forms that tended toward abstraction, and they incorporated a wide range of materials through the use of innovative processes and techniques. While these styles were initially a turn of the century aesthetic phenomena in response to the industrial age, modernism and modernist art vastly accelerated during the clamor of the First World War, the greatest collective trauma in history to that point. World War I reshaped the perceptions of what art is, pushing forward notions of dystopia and disillusionment that emerged in all the arts created during and in the aftermath of the war.
How that conflict shaped modern consciousness is found in the devastating work of a generation of war poets and writers who all served in uniform, in the ironic and dissonant humor that permeates the music of classical composers, and in the savagely critical paintings and prints of the visual artists. While I was writing this lecture, I played incessantly Eric Satie, and who is one of these war composers. His music was calming for me. Throughout the long century, when modernist styles reigned, the artists included in the exhibition created abstract, Fauvist, Cubist, Expressionist, Dadaist, and Surrealist inspired artwork. Nearly all modernist styles emerge from abstractionism, which is defined as freedom from representational qualities in art and not representing things pictorially. It's the Russian artist Wassily Kandinsky who's widely credited with abstractionism as a distinct 20th century modernist style. He was an art theorist with a condition known as synesthesia, a color sensitivity that allowed him to hear and see color, and that paintings, Kandinsky believed that different shades provoked a range of emotions and sounds, and that paintings should be able to touch the parts of the brain that connected with music. Abstractionism was regarded as the perfect artistic vehicle for expressing the events of the First and Second World Wars. Werner Drews, a German artist who had emigrated to the U.S. during the rise of the Nazi regime, was one of the founders of American abstractionism, and his paintings depict an exploration of color and line, using abstract form to suggest the range of human emotions. Fauvism. The name Le Fauve was coined by the critic Louis Boissel when he saw the work of Henri Matisse and André Derain in an exhibition at the Salon du Automne in Paris in 1905. This style of painting emphasized the use of vivid, non-naturalistic colors through an expressionistic painterly technique aggressively applied straight from the paint tubes to create a sense of an explosion on the canvas. Even though the style was short-lived, it had an important influence on the German expressionists. André Lehoux experimented with the colorful Fauvist style during the early years of his career, before he was conscripted into the French army during World War I. Cubism. Cubism was a revolutionary style and movement created principally by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque in Paris in 1907. Perspective with a single viewpoint was abandoned, and the style made use of simple shapes, interlocking planes, and later collage. The aim was to bring together different views of depicted subjects, resulting in paintings that appeared fragmented and abstracted. Cubism opened up almost infinite possibilities for the treatment of visual reality and was the starting point for many later abstract styles. While Benton Murdoch's Bruants volunteered to serve in the Second World War after the bombing at Pearl Harbor, he was turned down by the military because of poor health. His 1940 study demonstrates the transatlantic transmission of the Cubist style. Expressionism. Expressionism began in Germany in 1912 and was an artistic style in which artists sought to depict not objective reality, but rather the subjective emotions and responses that objects and events arouse within a person. This technique was accomplished through distortion, exaggeration, primitivism, and fantasy, and through jarring, violent, or dynamic applications of formal elements. Expressionism was an active style from the years just before the First World War and through much of the interwar period. Although Max Beckmann is classified as an expressionist, he rejected both the term and the movement and associated himself in the 1920s with new objectivity, a style that was an outgrowth of expressionism that opposed introverted emotionalism. During the First World War, Beckmann served in the German military as a medical orderly. His dramatic war service coincided with a dramatic transformation of his style from academically correct depictions to a distortion of both figure and space, reflecting his altered vision of himself and of humanity. Two other significant art movements came about quite specifically because of the First World War. The first, the Dadaists, was a nihilistic, anti-art, anti-war group of artists, writers, and performers exempt from military service who came together in neutral Switzerland in negative reaction to the horrors and follies of the Great War. The second, the Surrealists, was a post-war avant-garde collective of artists and writers that spread throughout Europe from France and Belgium with the purpose of releasing the creative potential of the unconscious mind so as to reconcile it with rational life. So Dadaism. In response to the First World War, Dada artists called into question every aspect of society, including the arts, with an aim to destroy traditional values in art and to create a new art that would replace the old. Dada artists produced satirical and nonsensical art, poetry, and performances. Dada, a French word meaning hobby horse, was not an artistic style, as its proponents had rejected traditional modes of artistic creation. Rather than produce paintings and sculpture, these artists made collages, photomontages, and found object constructions. As Dadaist Hans Arp wrote, revolted by the butchery of the 1914 World War, we in Zurich devoted ourselves to the arts. While the guns rumbled in the distance, we sang, painted, made collages, and wrote poems with all our might. In 1964, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the launch of the First World War, Dada artists Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp came together to create lithographs to accompany poems by noted Dada and Surrealist art collector Arturo Schwarz, an Italian art historian, poet, curator, and gallery owner. The portfolio, The Absolute Reality, was published by the Schwarz Gallery in Milan and included this drawing for a reading degree, an apt and nonsensical memorial to Dadaism. Surrealism. Surrealism was officially launched in 1924 by the poet André Breton, who had served as a doctor during the First World War, where he became fascinated by the neurotic and even insane soldiers he cared for. The irony of treating madmen in a time when millions of soldiers were being bombed, shot, and gassed to death at the orders of confidently rational generals was not lost on Breton. When he began the Surrealist movement, it was a revolutionary and violent protest against the rationalism that had guided European culture and politics and that had culminated in the horrors of the war. Drawing heavily upon theories adapted from Sigmund Freud, Breton saw the unconscious as the wellspring of the imagination. Surrealism became the means of reuniting conscious and unconscious realms of experience so completely that the world of dreams and fantasies were fully integrated with the everyday rational world. Surrealists emphasized methodical research and experimentation, stressing the work of art as a means for prompting personal psychic investigations and revelations. Uncommon images were juxtaposed, and the artwork often featured elements of surprise and unexpected non sequiturs. In the painting by Moreau in this exhibition, created nearly 50 years after the earliest surrealist expressions, he explored conscious and unconscious personal fantasies through childlike automatic drawing techniques. The many phases of the different art practices leading up to, during, and after the First World War cannot be adequately summed up with such a brief review. Yet one striking quality or characteristic does permeate across these styles. There is something minatory, menacing, threatening, and intimidating featured in this work, and it offers a warning to us about who we are. Artwork is an active witness. While artists were responding as they saw fit to the ravages of the First World War, official government-sponsored programs were established to visually record the war. This was art-making as an active witness, a visual documentation created for the ages. While such recordings may well have been commissioned as matter-of-fact studies of battlefield landscapes, more often than not, the scenes recorded were emphatic renderings of traumatic events. Complementing the artwork created by official war artists is that produced by about everyday life by artists working at the home front. They too depicted scenes of war, but as it was experienced by civilians. During both the First and Second World War, the British government commissioned artists to produce official war art. During World War I, there were two streams of activity. The first was the task of collecting all kinds of materials, documenting the war for the newly formed Imperial War Museum, established by an act of Parliament in 1917. The second was a record in memorial to the war, and these paintings were commissioned from the best and, on occasion, the most avant-garde British artists of the day. During the Second World War, there was a more structured approach to official picture collecting when the War Artists Advisory Committee, chaired by Sir Kenneth Clark, was established. Over 300 artists were commissioned by the committee. Following the war in 1946, 1/3 of the collection was allocated to the Imperial War Museum, and the rest was distributed to museums and galleries across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. This dry point engraving of a desolate, battle-ravaged landscape was created by James McVeigh when he was employed by the Army Printing and Stationery Service, and while he was based in Rouen in France in 1916. Later, he was appointed an official war artist and deployed to the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, where through 1917 and 1918, he accompanied the Allied advance into Palestine from Gaza to Damascus. Working in both watercolors and oils, McVeigh produced some 300 pieces, many of which are now in the Imperial War Museum. So the piece by Henry Moore does not reflect his war time work, but it's a nice piece to look at while I tell you about Henry Moore. He enlisted in the British Army when he was 18 years old and was the youngest man in the Prince of Wales' own civil service rifle regiment during the First World War. Injured during a gas attack in 1917, when he recovered, the remainder of Moore's war service was as a physical training instructor. He soon saw the war as wrong, wasteful, and anti-life. During the Second World War, Kenneth Clark, chairman of the War Artists Advisory Committee, was unsuccessful in his attempts to recruit Moore as a full-time salaried war artist, but he was able to purchase Moore's powerful drawings of Londoners sleeping in the London underground while sheltering from the Blitz. With a contract for further examples, Moore's shelter drawings completed between the autumn of 1940 and the spring of 1941 are regarded as among the finest pieces commissioned by the War Artists Advisory Committee. Now we'll jump to Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall and his family were war refugees. In 1941, during the Second World War, the Jewish Chagall family narrowly escaped the German-influenced Vichy government in France after they had been stripped of their French citizenship, arrested and jailed. Under the lead of Alfred Barr, director of the Museum of Modern Art, Chagall's name was added to a list of prominent artists whose lives were at risk and should be allowed to immigrate to the United States. A representative of the operation responsible for rescuing European artists and intellectuals pressured the French police with scandal if the Chagall family was not released. In May of 1941, the Chagalls were spirited out of France and arrived in New York City about a month later, on June 23rd. Their daughter Ida and her husband soon followed on a refugee ship carrying a large case of Chagall's art, with other art work arriving later in the care of an intelligence analyst. Some 2,000 people were saved through the clandestine rescue operation. This painting by Chagall, possibly painted before the escape from France, but more likely completed while living in the U.S., can be read as a harrowing study of the actual flight to freedom experienced by the Chagalls themselves. Artwork for rehabilitation and well-being. Across eons of history, through poetry, music, and visual arts, the emotional and physical effects of trauma experienced by combatants on battlefields was recognized and recorded, but never really understood. It was not until the 19th century that medical doctors were able to distinguish between the mental and physical illnesses brought on by war. A first glimmering occurred during the American Civil War, when post-battle mental states known as DaCosta syndrome or soldier's heart was diagnosed as a weak heart or overexertion. A few decades later, when Sigmund Freud was treating traumatized women in late 19th century Vienna, their condition became known as hysteria, a female malady that was the link to understanding the physical and mental disorders of war-weary young men during and after the First World War. The term shell shock was first coined by British psychologist Charles Meyer in 1915. And even though some 80,000 cases were recorded during the war, it was a condition that was not treated with sympathy. Soldiers were expected to adhere to masculine ideals of bravery and resilience, to glory in war and not succumb to terror. The soldier who developed a traumatic neurosis was at best a constitutionally inferior human being and at worst a malingering coward. While the cause, effect, and treatment of shell shock filled the pages of medical journals during the war years, a sympathetic concern for the suffering soldiers was in direct opposition to the rationalist position of strategizing generals who needed them out of the hospital and back at the war front to carry out war maneuvering chess moves. In June 1917, the British General Staff issued General Routine Order Number 2384, banning shell shock as a diagnosis for any comrade in arms. Winning the war was far more important to them than caring for their traumatized troops. So the ordinary soldier carried the horrors of shell shock, pensively described by the British war poet Siegfried Sassoon. By night, each man was back in his doomed sector of horror-stricken front line, where the panic and stampede of some ghastly experience was reenacted among the livid faces of the dead. No doctor could save him then, and when he became the lonely victim of his own dream disasters and delusions. So I'm going to read just this one last section connected to the rehabilitation and well-being, which is actually work that I've done. I've done a lot of work on this, and so this is a very quick summary of a lot of work. The American military held the same position as the British military regarding primacy of war effort over medical care of the troops. Get them treated and back to the front as soon as possible. But during the war and in its aftermath, an approach to caring for the war wounded grew from the arts and crafts-based initiatives that intersected with medical care. Led by caregivers called reconstruction aides, the professions of occupational and physical therapy blossomed during and after the First World War. Renewal and restoration became the new post-war agenda, and the peacetime message, carry on, provided hope and resolution for the war wounded. Occupational and physical therapy, as well as vocational training, became useful and practical ways to rehabilitate the wounded and disabled. Originally divided into two curative levels, the first was bedside occupations, such as knitting and basket weaving, and was primarily regarded as a recreational activity. The second was a more purposeful form of training intended to prepare a disabled veteran for employment after discharge from the hospital. So there's other topics that could be covered, but we have to get